How COVID-19 could change the financial world order. Worldwide crises have the power to shift the balance of power in any direction. America has relied on its dominance of international finances since the end of World War II, with more than 80% of all international transactions made in dollars, and most countries keeping their international reserves in the US currency. However, things have been slowly changing for the last couple of decades thanks to China's unprecedented growth. But did you know that the coronavirus pandemic could be the perfect catalyst to seal the deal and establish a new financial world order where the US is no longer king? The consequences could completely disrupt the American way of life as we know it. Sit tight and turn up the volume on your headphones while we explore how the COVID-19 crisis could change the financial world order. But before we get started, please don't forget to support us with a like and subscribe for future videos. How did the US become such an economic superpower? We can trace the beginning of American supremacy back to the Great War. During the First World War, Britain, France, Italy, and other allies waged war against Germany while the US provided them with food, clothing, and military equipment, not only boosting America's industry and GDP, but also strengthening the US military industry. In the meantime, Europe paid for these products and services by selling bonds to US buyers. The conditions of these bonds were that they should be denominated in dollars, since Europe had to pay American companies for the supplies in the said currency, and so the hegemony of the dollar across borders began. By the end of the war, the United States had flipped from being a debtor to being a creditor, all the while sustaining minimal losses while Europe was completely devastated. By setting the economic foundation, the US set itself up for a promising future ahead. Even after a Great Depression, another World War, and the Cold War, America's military and economic power just kept rising and rising. Right after the 1920s, almost all international trade between Europe, parts of Asia, and America was denominated in US dollars. And by the turn of the 21st century, more than 80% of all international transactions and international reserves are denominated in US dollars. The fact that 80% of all global transactions and reserves are in dollars is what gives the US its financial power today. You see, if country A wants to trade with country B, the transactions will almost certainly be done in dollars. To transfer the funds, banks rely on an international telecom system called SWIFT, short for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, which is based in Belgium. But if the exchange is denominated in dollars, even with SWIFT, the transaction has to go through New York, and Uncle Sam will know about it. This gives the US a lot of power to enforce its sanctions against countries they disagree with, therefore calling the shots in global trade. But while such power and hegemony remained unquestioned and unrivaled throughout the years, something changed a couple of decades ago that is about to tip the scale of the financial world order. What changed? China did, back in 1979. China used to be a secluded and poor population, with an economy that mostly relied on agriculture. However, in 1979, they decided to open up to the world, allowing international investment in Chinese soil and adopting a series of free market reforms, effectively shifting away from communism and moving closer to outright capitalism. The effects were astonishing, since they've been the fastest growing economy since, with an increase in GDP of almost 10% per year since 1980. The big boom came when companies saw an opportunity to cut production costs in manufacturing, thanks to the super low wages in China and certain tax benefits. By the 90s, almost any company that wanted to produce anything at a competitive price had to take its manufacturing operations to China, which brought billions of dollars into the Chinese economy. Today, China is already the second biggest economy in the world, second only to the United States by GDP. The latter's GDP stands at around $24 trillion, while China's GDP is a little over $17 trillion. However, China is growing faster than the US, and experts predict it will take the first place by 2030. China is challenging the US dollar as the international trade currency. Being number 2 in the world and closing in on the US gives China steady footing to challenge the United States' control over international finances, in particular their control over SWIFT due to the hegemony of the US dollar. This is not to say that Chinese companies are going to start trading in renminbi on Wall Street overnight. That is unlikely to happen. What they're doing is changing the way people use money to pay for their purchases. China is the world leader in cashless purchases, but not in the same way that cashless works in the West. For Americans, cashless means credit cards, which means Amex, Visa, or MasterCard. In China, the majority of the population is relying on digital wallets and smartphones to make payments. Credit cards never went as mainstream in China as they did in the rest of the world, so when they needed a solution for cashless payments, they turned to an awesome infrastructure that was already in place, and which was controlled completely by the Chinese: mobile telecommunications. So they effectively bypassed credit cards altogether, not relying on Visa and MasterCard payment networks at all, and jumped straight into mobile payment. Today, the top 3 mobile payment solution providers in China, UnionPay, Alipay, and WeChat Pay, accrue almost 3 billion customers across China and Asia, and process trillions of dollars worth of transactions every month. Now, this volume of transactions is mostly internal, not international, so how does this threaten the US dollar as an international trade currency? The worldwide expansion of Chinese digital wallets. The first major threat to the hegemony of the dollar is the fact that once you load money to a digital wallet, you can use it to buy almost anything, so long as the merchant accepts that form of payment. The problem with this is that these transactions occur in a parallel, private network that is not controlled or even seen in any way by the US or any other government for that matter, but by the likes of Alipay and friends. What this means is that once you have your money loaded to the network, you can basically spend it however you want without the control of the US. The only reasonable explanation that it hasn't taken off globally is likely because of the nature of communism. Western nations have low or no trust on any platform that is purely controlled by the Chinese government. The digital yuan. Ant Financial and Tencent, the companies behind Alipay and WeChat Pay, are so big that even the Chinese government is afraid of them and their influence over the economy. This spurred China to develop a state-controlled digital currency, dubbed the digital yuan, based on blockchain technology that would allow for the government to keep track of transactions in order to avoid money laundering, drug traffic, tax evasion, or other illegal activities. But the most important aspect of the digital yuan is the fact that it provides a parallel currency to trade with China without going through the US dollar. The worldwide expansion of Chinese banks. So, China has one of the fastest, most prolonged growth on record, and China's banks have also grown accordingly. If you Google the biggest banks in the world, you'll find that the biggest of all is the International and Commercial Bank of China. But there are also 3 other Chinese banks on the top 10 list. While American banks like JP Morgan have had a stable performance the past few years, Chinese banks are continuously growing, and it won't be long before they surpass all the competition. This hasn't been much of a threat to America so far, since those banks have kept their business mostly domestic. But they're already starting to expand internationally, which means that in a few years, we will see Chinese financial institutions across the entire world. Now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with the coronavirus pandemic. We'll get to that in just a minute. You won't want to miss it. Enter the coronavirus crisis. As the manufacturing hub of the world's largest supplier of medical equipment, and the leaders in the search for a vaccine, China is a key player in the current pandemic. While being the sole provider of basic goods, products, and raw materials for millions of businesses around the world, the moment China shut down due to the pandemic, businesses everywhere felt the pinch and started to struggle. That was only made worse by the lockdown measures that came after the pandemic hit other parts of the globe. So what we have now is a battered global economy desperate for medical supplies to cope with the pandemic, desperate for manufactured goods to fuel the reactivation of the economy, but without money since they spent it all trying to help people and businesses affected by the crisis. Now that China has managed to get the virus under control, things are all of a sudden starting to look like the World War I. Only this time, it's China with the goods, the medicines, the food, and the money, and it's the rest of the world that is fighting the war against the virus, particularly the United States. It's a safe bet to assume that China will leverage the situation in the same way the US did before, and condition loans and financial transactions to be made in the recently rolled out digital yuan, taking a big chunk out of the foundations of the dollar's hegemony. The effects, what the future holds. For years, economists have argued that when it comes to the dollar as the main currency for international trade, there is no other choice. After seeing what's happening with China, many of them believe that sooner than later, we'll have the world divided into two separate parallel international trade networks that could either work together or against each other. Do you think that we're headed towards a future in which we'll have to start converting prices to yuans? Or will the USA figure out a way to counteract China's growth without unleashing World War III? Leave a comment and join the discussion. Please support us with a like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.